He was just a hospital janitor, quiet, invisible, the kind of man people walked past without a second glance. But when a wounded soldier was rushed in, bleeding out with no surgeon in sight, something unimaginable happened in that hallway. What no one knew was that the man holding the mop had once been trained to save lives on the battlefield, not clean floors. And in the next few minutes, a decision would be made that would either expose a buried truth or cost a man his life. Why was a trained surgeon hiding in plain sight as a janitor? And why was no one ready for what he was about to do? It was another long, exhausting shift inside the hospital where no one really noticed him. The man everyone called the janitor moved quietly through the corridors, pushing his cart from room to room, cleaning away the traces of other people's emergencies. He kept his head down, speaking only when spoken to, always careful not to take up too much space in a place that felt like it didn't belong to him. Most staff barely remembered his name. To them, he was part of the background, like the humming lights or the steady beep of distant monitors. But what they didn't know was that years ago, he had stood in a very different place under very different lights, where every second meant the difference between life and death. He had once been trained to make impossible decisions in the chaos of war zones, saving soldiers when there was no time, no perfect conditions, and no second chances. But none of that mattered here. In this hospital, he was just a cleaner in a faded uniform, quietly surviving each day. Still, something about this place felt different today. The atmosphere was heavier, nurses moved faster. Doors kept swinging open and shut with urgency. Whispers of a critical patient spread through the halls, a soldier fighting for his life after arriving in the worst possible condition. And yet, despite all the urgency, there was a delay, a hesitation, as if something or someone was stopping the help from reaching him fast enough. The janitor noticed everything. He just didn't know yet that in a few moments, he would be forced into a situation that would reveal exactly who he was and what this hospital was really made of. The emergency call came in like a storm breaking loose inside the hospital walls. A young soldier had been rushed in, severely wounded, slipping in and out of consciousness, his condition worsening with every passing second. The kind of case where every delay meant losing him forever. But as the doors swung open, something strange happened. Instead of immediate action, there was hesitation. Orders were shouted, teams were called, but there was a visible pause, a disconnect between urgency and action. The corridor filled with tension that didn't belong to the medical emergency alone. The janitor noticed it all while quietly continuing his work nearby, pretending not to listen, pretending not to care. But he knew that kind of silence. It wasn't uncertainty, it was avoidance. Minutes stretched, voices grew sharper, someone mentioned protocol, someone else insisted on waiting for a specialist who was still on the way. And the soldier, still bleeding, was running out of time. The janitor's grip tightened slightly on his cart as he passed by the trauma room. Through the glass he saw the chaos. Monitors flashing warnings, nurses moving too fast, too frantic, and a body on the table that was fading fast. Something inside him shifted, not panic. Not confusion, recognition. He knew that injury pattern. He had seen it before, not in textbooks, but in places where help never arrived on time. Places where you either acted immediately or watched someone die. A sharp voice cut through the hallway, ordering non-essential staff to stay out. The words landed like a barrier, not just against the situation, but against anyone who didn't belong in that space. The janitor paused. For a moment he just stood there, unseen, dismissed, invisible as always. But inside the trauma room, the monitors began to scream louder. The soldier's condition dropped again. A nurse called out that they were losing him, still no specialist, still no action. That was when the janitor took one step forward, then another. A nearby staff member immediately blocked his path, irritated, questioning why he was even there. The tone wasn't just professional, it carried something colder underneath, something about who was allowed to be in control and who was. He was told to move away. But as he looked through the glass again, watching the fading life on the table, something broke through years of silence and invisibility. Because he didn't just see a patient. He saw a moment where waiting meant death. And in that split second, he made a decision that would either be called impossible or unforgivable. The moment he stepped closer to the trauma room, everything changed. The staff didn't just stop him, they reacted like a boundary had been crossed that should never be crossed. Voices rose instantly, sharp and dismissive, demanding he step back, insisting he had no authority, no clearance, no place anywhere near what was happening inside. But through the glass, the situation was collapsing. The soldier's condition had reached a critical point. monitors flashed warnings in rapid sequence. The medical team was losing rhythm, losing control, losing time. Every second that passed felt heavier than the last, like the entire room was sinking under something invisible but unstoppable. And the janitor, once again reduced to nothing more than a uniform and a title, stood frozen at the edge of it all. Then came the moment that shattered everything. A senior voice inside the room ordered an immediate procedure, but the hesitation was obvious. No one moved fast enough. Fear of making the wrong decision was louder than the urgency to save a life. That was when the janitor finally spoke. Quiet, firm, controlled, not as someone asking for permission, but as someone who already knew exactly what needed to be done. For a brief second, the entire hallway seemed to go silent, not because they understood him, but because they didn't expect him to say anything at all. And then it came, a wave of resistance. Laughter from disbelief, sharp rejection. Accusations that he was interfering, that he was delusional, that he was just a janitor trying to play doctor in a life-or-death situation. The words hit harder than any physical barrier, not because they were loud, but because they were familiar. Still, he didn't step back. Inside the trauma room, the monitor gave another warning, lower, weaker, closer to flatline. The soldier was slipping beyond reach. A split-second decision hung in the air: obey the system that was failing or trust the man they refused to see. And as the alarms grew louder, the janitor finally reached for the door, while every voice in the room shouted for him to stop. The room didn't stay in chaos for long, but it felt like time itself had bent around what happened next. In the seconds that followed, decisions were made not out of protocol, but out of desperation. The resistance that had filled the hallway cracked under the pressure of a life slipping away. And in that narrow space between doubt and action, the janitor was finally allowed in. What happened inside wasn't spoken about loudly afterward. It wasn't turned into a story in meetings or proudly shared in reports. It was quieter than that, uncomfortable even for those who witnessed it. But the result was undeniable. The soldier survived, barely. Days later, when the truth finally surfaced, that the janitor had once been a combat-trained surgeon who had saved lives in conditions far worse than this hospital, silence fell in a different way. Not the silence of dismissal, but the silence of realization. Because what had almost been lost wasn't just a patient. It was trust, it was judgment. It was the cost of assumptions made too quickly about who is capable and who is not. No apology could fully undo what had happened in that hallway. No explanation could erase the fact that a man's life had hung in the balance because people saw a uniform instead of a human being. And for him, nothing truly returned to normal either. He went back to the same corridors, the same floors, the same invisible existence. But now everyone knew what they had once refused to see. The story spread quietly through the hospital, not as gossip, but as a warning buried in shame. Because the hardest truth wasn't that he was qualified. It was that he had always been there, and no one had bothered to look closer. So the question remains: how many other lives are overlooked every day simply because we decide too quickly who deserves to be seen? And if someone's worth can be hidden in plain sight, what else are we still refusing to see?